Alejandro, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
What brings you to World Water Week 2016?
Well, I'm not a water person, and that is very clear here at the conference. It's great to see so much expertise together. I mean, at the Earth Security Group, we're coming from a slightly different angle. We're looking at what are the threats that are related to access to resources in developing countries in particular that really constrain the sustainable growth of companies. And it obviously ranges from water, food security, climate change, energy scarcity, carbon intensity of electricity, and so on. And what we find is obviously water is really fundamental across the board. Right? We've done a piece of work where we've looking at the depletion of aquifers as being one of those issues that is really critical to the sustainability of the planet, but also to the political risk that companies are facing in many drought-prone regions. And we're coming here to Stockholm to present this work, to convene companies and governments and policymakers to begin to explore how do they work together to strengthen the governance of these aquifers.
As the founder, why did you found ESG?
Well, I had been working on corporate sustainability for over a decade. I guess that what really caught my attention was the fact that even though companies over the last 20 years have been doing a lot on sustainability, there were a lot of the threats that they face in their operating context that have to do with greater resource constraints on a planet of limited resources. Right? And those things, they're more messy, they're more political, they're beyond the control of companies. And you need a different business approach in order to address them. So I would say I founded the Earth Security Group with a purpose that companies, in order to manage the risks that they face, to the license to operate, the social conflicts around various resources, they need to become more strategic in how they build the resilience of the countries where they operate. And in my view, that in a way is taking a step further in how companies understand sustainability. And there's a lot of work to be done, and we're finding there's a very exciting space of work.
So what sort of work do you undertake?
Well, we do two things. One is we have developed a tool that is using country data to really illustrate to both companies as well as other stakeholders like governments, what are the converging pressures? What is the big picture of issues that are happening in a country? Not just looking at water, but also looking at food security, looking at likely impacts of climate change, but also looking at poverty and demographics, unemployment, urban demographic pressures, and things like inflation. Right? So you really get a totally new picture of what are the convergence of pressures in that place. And out of that, we're able to say, what are the likely scenarios for what will undermine a particular company or undermine the stability of a government in different developing countries. Now, in terms of what we do with these capacities, we apply these to projects. So we've been working on a very diverse set of things, from palm oil in Indonesia to climate change impact in India, and now we're working on the forced displacement crisis in Syria and how it impacts the neighbors. But the common theme is that we're always looking at it from the perspective of how are companies affected by these external conditions, and what can companies do in order to build stability in the operating context. Now, for companies that are in very resource-intensive sectors, say mining, energy, infrastructure, food and agriculture, where the investments are made in a place it's very difficult to move somewhere else. You're basically there for 20, 30 years. Now, these pressures really matter. And so through the different projects that we do, usually in partnership with governments, we convene companies to really figure out how you can begin to build greater resilience in an environment that is getting much more volatile. And then the other work that we do is really with companies specifically on an advisory role, looking more into depth in terms of what are the specific challenges that they face in key markets or in key sourcing countries across the board. Therefore, what does that mean for the global position? What does that mean for the strategy? And how they engage society and how they engage with the local stakeholders in the places where on which they depend for their resources.
Are you finding there's an educational process for corporates in order that they understand this is a process that they need to go through?
Absolutely, and that is happening on many levels. Yeah? The first thing that is important to understand is that the landscape of corporate sustainability is changing dramatically. Why? Because the world is changing dramatically, and the pressures out there on demographic growth and access to water and availability of food, they're just becoming very, very big. Now, obviously, this constrains the ability of a company to deal with certain risks. Yeah? Now, the capacity that is needed is really ranging in a number of domains. If you're thinking about banks, analysts in banks are thinking about what stocks to invest in, and they're thinking about, if I will invest in certain mining companies, what is the risk profile of this company in the countries where it operates, right? And what we find there is that there's a lot of work to be done in how analysts, let's say, enhance their ability to understand the systemic risks that are affecting companies. How might they affect companies? And do companies have the right systems in place to, let's say, confront those risks? Something similar happens from a company perspective, right? And even though the landscape of action from the business angle is very wide, so companies are doing a lot of good work. Yeah? All we're saying is there's certain things that companies are, let's say, trying not to address because it's just too complicated. And these are the areas where companies need to be more decisive. And let me give you one example. Yeah? Land grabs. Yeah, everyone is now familiar with this. It affects food and agriculture companies, forestry companies, mining companies, real estate companies doing development, even solar energy companies trying to put a solar park, and where do you put it? And so land is becoming more constrained. When companies operate in countries that have weaker governance systems, then it's just a Pandora box, right? And what we're saying, we're showing companies is that there is a way to invest and there's a way to engage with the issue of land tenure risk that is not just about saying we have a policy of zero tolerance, because it's very difficult for companies to monitor their supply chains and really know what's happening on the ground. What we're saying is more progressive. We're saying companies that are going to invest in a place that find that there's weak or ambiguous, let's say, governance of land titles with local communities, they can actually play a role in helping communities acquire the land titles that they need, right? And I think this really puts the concept on its head. We call this business diplomacy for sustainable development. Companies really can play a catalytic role in helping address some fundamental development challenges around the world. And why do it? Because it's essential to your license to operate over a period of time, basically. And so I think it's very important to bring that mindset in at the higher level, but also very specifically, what does it mean in different operating contexts? And what is the menu of options that companies should be carrying forward in order to build stability and grow more sustainably.
So what next for ESG?
Well, I would say I'm personally quite thrilled by the sorts of projects that we're doing. I mean, we've really, I think, starting to cement this mindset. We're seeing banks, we're seeing big agribusiness firms, big mining infrastructure companies really wanting to have the conversation and wanting to find out specifically in particular countries, is my strategy the right one, right? How does my strategy compare to the scenarios of that country? Where are the gaps and opportunities? I find that is quite interesting because it's very practical. So I think that is clearly a very exciting area of work, to work at the level of individual companies, because the things that you can do are so practical and you can make so much progress when you really start to use a company's assets, the value chains, as a driver of change. There's part of the conversation that has to do with how people within companies working on sustainability begin to inform the work of the risk managers, they begin to inform the work of the government affairs departments. So there's really a lot of work within companies that needs to happen for let's say, corporate functions that weren't used to thinking in terms of sustainability to really begin to get to grips with what are the priorities, what are the 4 or 5 issues that we really need to be driving in governments. And I think that that's really where with a sustainability agenda, it needs to go next. Right? It's very clear that companies now have the capacity to work networks at a pre-competitive level with different, across sectors and with other companies. It is very clear that in the governmental space, governments keep meeting to agree conventions and so on. But what is less clear is how do we begin to bridge these two languages and two narratives, and that when a company, a very practical level, when a company is faced with unemployment pressures in a country, right, and the government is really driving a lot of pressure on the company to hire local people, but it's just not doing it in a way that is constructive because it doesn't understand what that industry needs, right? And the company says, well, this pressure is just not right. We're just not going to invest in the country. We're going to go somewhere else. You can very quickly see that there could be a different narrative for that, where if a government understood what is the potential for job creation of a company, not just through employees, but through promoting SMEs, and this really links to the whole SDG agenda in a very powerful way, then the potential for win-win solutions will be much, much bigger. And this is really where we as Earth Security Group are planning to play a very strong role, which is really to be that translator in a way, and really be able to capture, okay, what are the big issues, but then how does this translate to very practical agreements and policies and decisions and investments that are needed to go to the next phase of this planetary challenge that we face.
Alejandro, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, appreciate it.